Ja, men gott kvöld allt sammen, og velkommen til denne fyrelesteren i kvöld. Og som vi har lyst, så får det handla om at loja i brøytingom. Og i kvöld vil det så av enskom. Og ja, så får jeg skifte litt til engelsk nå. Good evening, Stefan Cantori.
Good evening to you.
Greetings from the Faroe Islands.
And greetings from Sheffield.
And this evening, Stefan, you will talk about change management.
Yes, conversational approaches to the leadership of change is my topic.
Yeah, we are looking forward to it. People are tuning in now. And then I will say that when Stefan has done his talk for around 30 minutes, then you listeners, you have the opportunity to chat or write in a question. So if you are on Facebook, you can just chat below this screen, and it's the same on YouTube if you are there. Yeah, so Stefan, I will just give the word over to you in Sheffield.
Thanks very much, Johannes. And it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Stefan Cantori. My current role is as a senior university teacher, where I specialize in organization development and management learning at the University of Sheffield, working in its management school. And most of my work, if not all of my work now, is with executives who are taking time to do master's programs or MBAs in management as part of their professional development. So they work in their ordinary jobs, and then they work with me and colleagues around their qualification and development. So, but I haven't always been there. So I thought I might start with saying a little bit about how I come to be there and doing the work that I'm doing. I began my career working in healthcare and spent time as a senior director in National Health Service hospitals. That's the public hospital sector in the UK. So latterly as chief executive of a large hospital combined with community healthcare services. And that was obviously an important time of development. But all through that time of development, I had an interest in wondering why people behave the way they do and how that behavior changes. So that's been a continuing question for me during my career in healthcare. Subsequently, I worked in social care and in healthcare, seeking to find out ways in which whole systems might develop and change. So how might you increase collaboration? And how you might improve the offer of services to the communities. So that was interesting. And whilst working in that type of strategic role, I became really intrigued about what worked. So we had lots of approaches to change that we tested out, often with large groups of professionals. And each time we tried out a new technique or tool, things seemed to happen, but it didn't last. And I was puzzled why it didn't last. But then over time, over a few years, I realized that actually the things that seemed to last were those types of processes that were more conversationally orientated. So where people had conversations, where they sat down with a cup of coffee and exchanged their ideas with one another in a safe space. That type of engagement and work seemed to make a difference to people and seemed to then bear fruit in terms of improvement of services and changes to services. So I asked myself the question, well, can we create spaces where these sorts of conversations happen more regularly? And can you do that strategically? And what skills do I and we need to work in this way, which is quite different from our sort of normal ways of working. So anyway, we tried different approaches. I learned much. I did a master's in people and organization development. I then went into consulting, working with a wide range of commercial companies as well as the public sector. and I undertook a doctorate covering the topic of conversational consulting, which carried forward my interest really to explore how conversation can create change. And that was great fun. And then almost by accident, I think I found myself in academia, working at universities, firstly at the University of Southampton in the business school there, and then over the last couple of years here in Sheffield, again, asking questions about how does behavior change happen? How do we see fundamental shifts in complex systems? And what's the leadership needed to enable those changes to take place? So those are the questions that I've been working with. Maybe you've got some of those questions as well. Maybe you're persuaded already that conversation as an approach to change is great. If you are persuaded, then please do listen in. I'm really open to your questions and observations afterwards, after my talk. If you're not persuaded, I'd like to think that I'd go some way to persuading you. That's my aim, if you like, in this presentation, to encourage you to consider a conversational approach to the leadership of change. That's what I'm going to do over the next few minutes. I'm going to sort of combine a mix within my presentation. Yes, there's going to be a bit of theory. I wouldn't be working in a university if I didn't bring a bit of theory and research into a conversation like this one. But there's going to be practice as well. My preferred way of working is to be both scholarly and a practitioner. And I continue to work as a consultant, working primarily in healthcare, but also in higher education for various institutions and hospitals and healthcare services. So you'll get a bit of practitioner and a bit of theory, but then we can expand and explore those in greater depth through the conversation once I've finished my presentation. So moving on, I want to ask you really a question to start with about, have you got a grip of your own leadership habits, your own change leadership habits? Working with lots of executives who come to our courses, I lead a module on leading change. Many of them come with an understanding of change and change leadership that is quite entrenched in the notion of that you as a leader can take control and can take charge of change, and that you are the hero of a change effort, and that people generally are, well, either they're sort of okay with it or they resist your great ideas. And this idea of leading change, of managing change, if you like, comes from a way back to an overarching metaphor. That's an image that has pervaded leadership development over many years, and that is the idea of an organization as a bit like a machine. You could call it, that actually what you need to do to bring about change is to shift the parts in the machine, re-engineer, and as you re-engineer, so the machine, the organization and the people in it will work much more effectively, that it's possible to control and manage in that type of way. So often you sort of see ideas like the circle I've got up here about a diagnostic phase. So when you think about change, you need to gather data, you need to then decide what to do with what you've your analysis, you then intervene, you do something, you evaluate the impact, and you then go around the circle again and contract for more change with the organization. So that's one way of thinking about change. On my right side on the screen there, you'll see the sort of 8 steps. A chap named John Kotter, an American academic and management consultant, produced these amazing 8 steps, which have been incredibly influential. So the idea here is that you begin at the bottom where you create urgency. You might have heard of this expression of creating a burning platform, like an oil refinery in the sea, and you create a fire, and that then stimulates activity. So this idea is that creates the climate for change. In other words, build some fear and anxiety. And then you move through various steps which then lead on to engaging. So most of the planning is done in one place, and the engaging and enabling, if you like, is done further down the track with a larger number of people. And then at the end, in point 8, you make it stick, whatever that means. The research behind this, there's hardly any that supports this, and I've never known a process to go from 1 to 8 and complete, because change and development is not like that. It's not linear. But these are the ideas and habits that have really influenced generations of leaders. And we need to come at thinking about conversation by first taking stock of our own assumptions and worldviews about how does change happen, who are people, how do they think, how do they behave, what's important for them, what you know, those are the sorts of questions. And here's just a little slide to give an idea of sort of what's been the dominant approach. I've talked about some of that, this notion of power through hierarchy, that the hierarchy, you know, the more senior person will guide the change and everyone else follows. The notion of rational argument, leadership driven, that's been the dominant approach. But what's been occurring over the last couple of decades is this emerging direction, and it's growing, is this notion that actually change occurs through power, which is expressed in connections across a complex system. It's not done on the hierarchy of the individual organization, but there's connections taking place, and those connections have power that influence the future. This notion of purpose, a more emotional sort of connection to change, not just an intellectual, this is what the figures say, this is what the analysis says we should do, but a need to connect and emotionally and make sense with emotions as well as with the mind. A grassroots approach, a more engaging approach of larger numbers of people, and the development of relationships that build a change over a period of time. So that's if you like where that's the big picture really of where the trends have been around leading change. And you can see there in the emerging direction where conversation might have a space. Recently, over the last couple of years, I've done some work, some research work, inquiry work in a complex system, two actually, one in healthcare and one in higher education, exploring the behaviours that are associated with effective leadership of change in complex systems. And by complex systems, I really mean any system we have, those where there are interconnections and human relationships which you can't completely predict. So that's my broad definition of complex. But here you see a little word cloud of behaviours. So they're behaviours, so empathizing, influencing, purposing, exploring purpose across a complex system, storying, thinking about stories we can tell and which can shape our understanding and perception of the system. But there is conversing, and conversing really, I would argue, shapes and can shape many of the other activities that are associated with leading change by enabling people to connect not just intellectually with what's happening, but also emotionally. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. So thinking about how we behave in complex systems as leaders, I'm arguing that they're not quite the same behaviours as we've been perhaps traditionally taught or assumed. There's new ways of thinking, and at the heart of leading change, I argue that we need to attend to creating spaces for learning. That actually learning is at the heart of change in complex systems, and conversational learning, enabling people to learn with one another and from one another, is fundamental to change in those complex systems. So that's my argument. If I were to pick two of those statements, I'd say conversing and leading for learning are the two that really go hand in hand and drive the rest. So I'm going to pause because I've spoken long enough, and I'd just like you to spend a couple of minutes doing your own piece of reflection. And I'd just like you to reflect in some detail about a time when you had a great conversation. It might be today, it might be a week ago, might have been years ago, but it sticks in your mind as a time when you engaged with someone in a conversation or a small group. It might be really informal. It doesn't need to be in an organization, but just think of a time when you had a great conversation and think about those questions. What made it happen? Be specific about the place. Who else was involved and how did it begin? What do you notice about how you felt during the time? Just think about that conversation. Just take a couple of minutes now. I'll restart in a couple of minutes, but just spend the time reflecting. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt your reflection if you're still dwelling on a great experience. But I'm sure as you thought about great conversation, maybe you have them regularly, maybe they become infrequent. I think one of the issues in our society is that generally there isn't enough space for conversation to be had. We're very busy. Perhaps now we're very focused on our technology because we need to be. During lockdown, we need to only have real contact with people through these means, through extended conversations or dialogues across the screens. But having a conversation, having a relationship where you felt trusted and you could trust the other person, where there's some great questions, where there's a movement going on, not just in your mind, but also in your heart. You're feeling drawn to perhaps a topic or drawn to the person themselves. I like this definition by the philosopher Theodore Zeldin, where he talks about conversations and meeting of minds with different memories and habits. And when they meet, they don't just exchange facts, they transform them, they reshape them, they draw different implications from them. They engage in new trains of thought. Conversation doesn't just reshuffle the cards, it creates new cards. And I love it because he's communicating that creativity within conversation that you don't perhaps get in your formal work meetings. In fact, in your work meetings, you may not have much creativity at all. It's very much about exchanging information, waiting for your space to talk. Whereas conversation is mainly, I would argue, listening well. So allowing yourself to listen well and to give the gift of listening to another person. And in doing so, trust is built, but spaces emerge where newness can manifest itself. So there's some magic, if you like, some mystery about conversation, engaging with another human being in this way that doesn't come from many of the processes that we've structured into organizational life. It's quite unusual for people to talk about having had a great conversation at work, I think. So thinking about conversation and thinking about, well, is there some more theoretical underpinning around conversation? And I'd like to introduce these folks. So these are what people I call theory and practice influencers. So we don't have much time to explore their theory. You might be pleased to know we'll just summarize. But Karl Marx is there, the chap with the beard. I think why I put him in there is his influence around the idea that we gain our social identity from being together, and that our individual identity is, if you like, related to our integratedness within a social community, that we are not just on our own. Our identity isn't our own. It's a collective effort, if you like. We are made by each other. We have a sense of who we are from each other. We are relational people. We don't just stand on our own. In fact, being on our own is a very painful position. And in fact, I think lockdown and all the things that are going on with COVID-19 demonstrate how painful it is to be on your own, if you like, and not be connected and not feel that sense of identity with others. And Marx identified that as being quite important and fundamental to who we are. Moving swiftly forward into the 1960s, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann developed this idea of the social construction of reality. So their argument was basically the only thing we know about our social world, about who we are in relation to one another, is what we do and what we say. We make it ourselves. There's no separate social reality from what we make it to be. So what we speak about, what we notice, how we are, is our reality. There's nothing separate from that. We can't step out of it and say, oh, I'm looking in on the social realm. We are part of it and we are making it. And we ourselves are being remade in our understanding of ourselves through our social interactions. So again, they were building a bit on Marxist thinking there, but they were sort of going further and saying, well, we really only know what we know through our interactions. Kenneth Gergen, a social psychologist, still around, really influential guy. He talked about many things actually, but one was about looking forward on the notion of generative images and being drawn towards an image of the future that's attractive, and that as we relate to one another and as we collaborate in creating those images, so they're likely to be energy giving and draw us in that direction. So he then sort of influenced David Cooper Ryder, who I put up there. David Cooper Ryder is the developer of a process and I guess a philosophy called appreciative inquiry, where he argues that the way we develop and change is through paying attention to what works well, and that as we look at what works well and examine what works well, we can then work together to seek to amplify what works well. And we do that through our interactions in conversation with one another. And he's quite a sort of important figure in this field. Patricia Shaw, a sort of English academic, she did a lot of work around conversation, linked in with complexity thinking, but arguing that organizing is essentially conversation. That as we organize, we are conversing. The two can't be distinguished. They are one and the same. We organize, we converse. They are all part of the same process. Gervase Bush and Robert Marshak developed this idea that's become quite influential called dialogic OD, organization development. So I've not got time to talk about organization development, just to say it's a collection of understandings and processes based on what OD practitioners call behavioral science. So that's psychology largely, but it's focused around looking at organizations as a whole entity. And they've sort of proposed that conversational processes have become more important and are an important branch of the practice of developing organizations and hence supporting change. So there's a few names to conjure with, to think about in terms of influences in this field. And in various ways, they shaped and encouraged the development of practices associated with hosting conversations. That's the language. It has its own language, really, hosting. You host a World Cafe. Some of you may have experienced that. Sort of room with tables. People sit at the table with a conversation starting question placed on the table, and then after 25 minutes, they move around to another table. A host stays at the table and connects conversations. Just an interactive way of having cake and coffee and conversation around questions that matter. Open space, another process where people can actually have more freedom to choose what workshops they want to create around what topics. And they use a particular process to enable them to self-organize their conversations. And there, the large circle, the appreciative inquiry with the affirmative topic in the center there, it's a process which begins by discovering what the best is, what's happened well, dreaming, creating an image of what might be if the best of the past happened all the time. Design becomes a bit more conventional, sort of looks at what do you need to do to enable your dream to become a reality, and then deliver is about what's the commitments to creating the future. So that's sort of a bit of a mixture, but I think what I want to say is both Open Space and World Cafe particularly are built on this idea that the change happens as the conversation happens. So it's not the case of planning a change, it's the conversation itself is the change, and it forms a shift in the reality being experienced by the system, by the people participating and those they have further conversations with. So it's quite different from that original image of planning a change. The change is going on as the conversations are happening, as reality is being shaped and reshaped through the interactions. And this is a little sort of image there of the idea of conversational leadership, which argues that conversation is a core process for leadership, and what they call collaborative social technologies are things like World Cafe, Open Space, appreciative inquiry. But it's a way of bringing together key stakeholders and surfacing the collective intelligence of the system. So it plays into the belief, I certainly have the belief, that one or two people cannot be the hero holders in their minds of everything we need to know. What we need to know in these days and in complex systems is what we all know, and have a way of collaborating and sharing that with one another in order to sort of bring forth a future that is helpful and healthy. And conversation is one of the ways in which that might be accomplished, that bringing together of people, that surfacing of wisdom, and taking then both reshaping the environment and our understanding of who we are, as well as agreeing actions we take between one another. So just in closing, my last couple of minutes. Leadership of change with less pain? Is it, if I were trying to convince you, if you're thinking about a change initiative or some need you have in your context, would I say it's without pain? I would say it does engage people in ways that other processes I don't think do. People take more ownership of their futures. There is a focus on what really matters. A lot of the learning comes from designing these processes. So what are the questions we're faced with? How do we frame those questions? And engaging as many people as possible in the design of the process. So it's a co-design effort, not something that's just done by a few individuals in a room on their own. Diverse perspectives are heard and understood. So as many different voices as you can get into the room. Most of the processes I facilitate, I ask people not to wear name badges with their job title on. It's about welcoming people regardless of their position, their power position in any hierarchy. But it's not for all. So if you like control and keeping control, then you're not going to be a fan of these processes. Managers can also feel bypassed because they feel they ought to be running things and they ought to be in charge of change. What's this about getting other people to be involved? And if you've got fixed ideas about the nature of change, then you're going to struggle with these approaches because they call from us new forms of thinking and behaviors that we might not be that comfortable with at this point in time. And the gain, I think there's a gain in engagement and experience of those within the system. I think this brings about rapid change in cultures and understandings. I think there's a myth around that culture change particularly takes forever to do. It's a long, long process. Well, I don't think it need be. And I think a conversational approach offers some rapid wins. You'll spend less on external consultants who arrive with a big folder, say this is how to do change. You'll use the wisdom available to you much more effectively, and the outcomes will be shared. But with a little caveat, if you want to change a technical process, if you want to sort of just look at one short, small process within your business or organization, you might be served by other approaches to change. I'm not arguing that a conversational approach is for everything, although I do think conversational approaches can be applied if you choose to, but you might want to choose different approaches in different contexts for different tasks. And gain benefit from those, of course. Presentation like this wouldn't be good without me ending with a little advert. I and my colleague Mark Gatenby have done some work around putting together our learning from our research. 3 small volumes available at any good booksellers, looking at co-design, particularly across complex systems, and the behaviors and the thought and how to learn as you undertake shifts and changes within those systems. So a little bibliography, and that brings my presentation to an end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much. And we have now half an hour. If people are eager to ask anything, then people can type in a question, and then I will ask it to Stefan. And Stefan, let me just say something in Faroese, and then I will switch back to English.
Okay.
Så tid, nu det en mulighet at spyrja omkring spurningar, og til godt bare spyrja først til chatta bare, altså i chatten. Her som det til Facebook eller YouTube, og til kan bare gjøre det først, og så skal det nok omsette til engelsk. Og så kan det lykke å si at Stefan Cantori, han røsten skriva bøker, og i kvöld snackar han om nekting, han snackar om World Café, han snackar om Open Space, han snackar om katter og alt möjligt. Og Stefan har skrivit en stötabok som heter Top Business Psychology Models, 50 Transforming Ideas for Leaders, Consultants and Coaches. Og han har en fin bok at ligga få en hitling av hva det til sier hovedøkene som han har nevnt i kvöld. Stefan, so I will start by asking you the first question. So you have said that this is a useful approach, and you have done it in private companies, I think you said, and in hospitals. Could it, for example, also be done in education?
Yes. Yes, certainly. I've worked in a range of educational settings. Worked with a primary school that was experiencing severe difficulties and was categorized by the regulator, the UK regulator, as in special measures. So very serious position. The view was that the children's education was being compromised. And they appointed a new head teacher who heard me speak and talk about conversational approaches. And I worked with her to develop an approach where we engage staff in a World Cafe and using appreciative inquiry, blending these approaches. And she also began a sort of coaching school within the school. So she developed coaching skills for staff and for pupils. And together we worked over a period of time. And she moved that school from a status of being in special measures, which is really serious. It's not special really good, it's special really bad, through to excellence in under 18 months, which was a record time. And she attributed these changes to conversational approaches that she'd integrated into her practice, but also into the way the school operated and how decision making took place, and how pupils and staff work together around learning. So that was one fantastic example of very rapid improvement in quite a very difficult situation, a very needy situation for the pupils. I've also worked in higher education, working with various departments within universities who've wanted to develop their strategies. Working with academics is a problem, as it's perceived by the managers of universities. Academics are viewed as perhaps not being that controllable, but through introducing cafe approaches and conversational approaches of different types, I found that academics are really willing to contribute to shaping strategy, but also finding themselves committed to it and willing to engage with it in the longer term. So that's my point about these processes as having long-term engagement benefits, not just nice to do, nice to have a conversation. Yeah, there's a couple of examples really.
There's a person here, Stefan, who's really interested in your book about the business psychology models. So I have just given them the title and the chat box. Let me ask you another question, Stefan. So if there is a director for a private company here, or for a hospital, or for a school, and they would like for you to come and work with them, so how would you kind of set up, let me say, 2 days of teaching? How would you go about to prepare the day, and how would you execute such 2 days, let's say 2 days?
Okay, well, we'll start with some hopefully great conversation. I think that's where these processes begin well, as we have a conversation, and the conversations are likely to offer us opportunities to surface what are the real questions. So to listen not just to one another, but also to listen to what the system is asking. My experience is that that's really important, to take care and to allow time to understand what it is that would be helped by adopting a conversational approach, whether that's through education around conversation approaches, or whether it's undertaking those processes within part of a sort of organizational event. For example, I recently did some work for a charity where they were struggling with what was their mission, and they'd got quite a lot of information. They'd done surveys, they'd talked to lots of stakeholders in different ways, but we used a conversational approach to bring people together around that information. So we use that information to then help inform the development of the strategy in a conversational way. So it would begin with a conversation, and then we'd shape something together. We'd look at what would work and what the purpose of it would be. I think thinking through purpose is really important. Why do we do those things? Not just because they're fun, although fun is great, but we do them because we have a sense that by engaging in conversation, something fresh and new will emerge for us. And it would be a process of testing out whether or not, as I said at the end of my presentation, whether or not it was the right fit, because some organizational contexts really are not in a space really without further work where they can sort of work with these processes. They feel very threatened. Some leaders feel extremely threatened by conversation. I can talk about it as being a very warm thing, a warm and cuddly and lovely thing, and I think it is a lovely thing. But I think it's got power to it, and that power is recognized by organizations and leaders quite quickly, and they can get quite agitated by, well, if, for example, events I organized, process I organized, we got everything set up, and then one of the senior managers came in and said, this looks all very good, Stefan, very exciting, we're looking forward to it, but I'd like so-and-so to be sitting over there on that table, and we don't want them to be talking to so-and-so over there, we want them over there. And they became extremely controlling and thinking, well, actually, we want to manage these relationships. We can't afford to allow people to interact. It's staggering, really, but that's what they thought. And clearly, for them, this approach was a step too far. They felt quite threatened by it. So we need to have sensitivity to that and to work through what would work, and to do it in a way perhaps that was relatively painless, maybe in just a part of an organization on a particular topic, that allowed people to engage and to experience it and to make their own assessment of it in terms of how it worked for them in their own leadership practice going forward. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer to a short question, Johannes. I don't know whether.
Stefan, we have a question here. Yes. So were they feeling uncomfortable, these leaders? Kind of.
Yes.
So was like anxiety, kind of, when they started to control kind of what you were doing. Do you think it was because of anxiety? Is the question.
Well, I think it was concern about. I think it's complex. I think it differs from person to person. But I think there was a lot about, well, who am I in this? Because I think conversation in that way sort of throws up questions about identity. I mean, managers, I think, rely on the fact that they're seen as irreplaceable. We need lots of problems, and managers revolve around that. And also, managers often want to keep the information knowledge they have. They, in organizations, status and power comes through knowledge as well as position. And what conversation does is it opens up the fields to explore knowledge and create new knowledge and create new insights. And that clashes with some people, because they say, well, who am I now in this? What's my role? What part can I play in this? And I would, if I met someone, and I've had conversations like that with people, I've said, well, actually, maybe now you can think about how you can contribute to improvement, how to facilitate conversational approaches to change, how you can encourage people to take up leadership in this way, and how you might encourage yourself in your own leadership to see yourself not as a problem solver, but as an improvement guide and supporter and encourager. So to shift the orientation of management. But people sense that that's where this might lead them, I think, and that's why they get anxious about who they are and what they're going to be doing, and what's this all about, and why can't I control it?
Now we have another question, Stefan. You talk a lot about conversations as this person, but how do you see the connection between conversation and reflection?
Good question. Well, I mean, I guess you could think of reflection and reflective practice as having a conversation with yourself in a way. You open up questions for yourself, you explore them. You don't have a conversation with another human being. I think there's something special about a conversation with another human being. But reflection can help you become a more skilled at conversation, because in reflecting, you pay more attention to the environment, you listen to others, you reflect on what others have said, you listen to your own internal dialogue, and listening is so fundamental to conversation. We've been made with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and the idea is that you use two ears. Your ears twice as much as you use your mouth. That's quite important. So listening and understanding yourself and understanding others and reflecting on that can really help in conversational process. It can also help you make sense of what might go on in a conversation where there's turbulence, perhaps where you're faced with some challenge in that conversation. Reflective practice allows you to take stock of that and to process that. So the reflective practitioner really does sort of have good equipment, if you like, tools to help with conversational practice. And also perhaps, I don't know, I've got no evidence to support this or research to support it, but perhaps becomes less defensive in the course of conversational practice, because they're more secure and know they have a place where they can go to process what goes on in a conversation or in a situation. There's an equipment for them. There's a capacity they have to work with it. So it's a great question. I'd be interested in other people's thoughts.
There's actually a further question from this one, Stefan, that this person asks, so when you are in a state of reflection, is it also a place where your feelings can come up, and maybe during your reflection you can become excited and then you kind of want to see a change coming? So is reflection maybe also, you talked about getting in contact with emotions. So a time of reflection could that also connect it with some how do you say it, some wishes you have?
Oh yes, I do a lot of, in my teaching, I do a lot of work around supporting people become reflective practitioners. So I'm a big fan of reflection, but I think it has its limitations, and I think that's my argument, that conversation itself is what we're made for. We're made for relationship. One of the trends in society is what I've called hyper-individualism, where we have given prominence to individuals and ourselves as individuals, and see the individual as being the final sort of judge of all that's good. If it feels good for me as an individual, then that's what matters. We become hyper individualistic. Certainly, I think in the UK, and I think more broadly in the West. And I think conversation, if you like, asks us to reflect on that and to say, well, actually, is it all about me? Am I not part of a wider relational system? Have we gone too far with individualism? Are we too narcissistic, where it all becomes about me? Or should we stop and take stock of that state we've entered into, of it all being about the individual and becoming more connected? So creating hunger for relationship, hunger for conversation, rather than hunger for greater self-esteem or whatever it is we hunger for as an individual.
And we have a very interesting question here, Stefan. He says, hello, Stefan. Thank you for the great explanation on the subject.
Thank you.
Kudos for you. And then he has a very interesting question. So he says, do you think that a small state society like the Faroe Islands shall use such a conversational approach with some kind of special, how do you say it, or is it different maybe to use such a conversational approach in a small state compared to a large society as you live in England? And then the person says, people might feel put off by the thoughts of speaking openly about certain subjects here, especially in smaller villages where more focus is put on individuals. Conversation is not as open here in the Faroe Islands because individuals don't want to be identified with controversy, especially by leaders. So this is something about power dynamics, and also kind of in this very close, small society we live here in the Faroe Islands.
Yes, and I think that's a really good question. And I think immediately I thought of a piece of work I did for a small consulting company. Had about 120 employees, and they asked me if I would run a process for them, a conversational process, a mixture of World Cafe and a bit of open space, a bit of a range of processes. And there was a bit of nervousness amongst the leaders. They were a bit sort of, so are we managing these people? As you know, saying, well, actually, these are the questions they've come up with. Let's see where it goes in terms of the conversation. And it was about visioning, actually. It was about what do we want to see this company become? And all seemed to be going sort of well. And then we had a round of feedback. So it's not that the conversation doesn't happen, you know, and is just left. There's often a sort of what's called a harvest in the terminology, in the jargon. There's a conversational harvest. And people shared some insights from the various tables. And a number of young women stood up and said, well, we need a company that stops harassment of young women. And this was something we knew about. This was understood as being part of the way the founders, the owners of the company had operated. The owners were present. And these women took great risk to bring out that through the conversation and to share it publicly. But by sharing it publicly, what then happened was that it went into a report of the event, and it was reported on and discussed by the board. And in the end, two of the owner founders resigned as a result. They moved on. There was an exposure of the issues. It became clear that the old company could not continue with its harassing environment. So what I would argue, I think, is that the conversational process empowered people to take what they saw as reasonable risks, that they made their own judgments, that this was about adults taking ownership for themselves of their environment, and with staggering sort of consequences indeed. And other conversational processes also have similar consequences, sometimes very sort of, I mean, not like that necessarily, sometimes just, I've seen redesigns of clinical pathways for patients happen live within a conversational process which is completely unexpected. So people realize they are connected with one another and they have something to offer each other, and that changes things for the better. I think what's critical is what are the questions that are being formed, and to be used as the beginning of the conversation. So what questions are you doing? Are you doing questions that are around building on strengths, like an appreciative inquiry process? Are you asking questions like, what's wrong around here? You know, that's a question that I wouldn't put into a conversation actually myself. I'd counsel against it. I'd want to follow the generative principle of conversational practice, which is to say, what might be if the best of our past happened all the time? I'd encourage that type of question, because actually that engages us more. Think about the exercise you did. You know, just in my talk, if I put a question up there, talk about a conversation where you got angry and things went wrong, you know, your mood would have shifted, your views, your perceptions, a lot would have happened. But questions themselves shape what the future becomes. So the questions are critical in these processes, because as we ask questions, so that becomes our attention, where we take the future.
Yeah, we are almost running out on time. If someone else has a question, you can type in the question. Ja, så om akkurat de kan høre en spurningatrett, så kan de bare skrive den inn. De kan godt skrive førskånd, så omsetter jeg til engelsk. Well, Stefan, let me just take a small talk question. So if there are some people who want to hear more from you and they would like to invite you to come to the Faroe Islands to do a workshop, would you be open to that?
Absolutely. I'd be open for traveling anywhere apart from Sheffield, because we've just been put into what's called Tier 3 lockdown. So we're quite closed down now. So the trip to the Faroe Islands, which I've been promising to do for a while now, would be fantastic to do.
Yes, Stefan, I think we will close off now. Thank you very much. And do you maybe have a final thought to kind of say goodbye with Stefan?
Well, I just wish you well. I think conversational practice in the Faroe Islands would be brilliant. I think you could use it well. I think it requires skill development. I think it's something that needs to be done carefully, but it could go extremely well. I think in a place where people think they know one another, but actually they learn more about one another through conversation. So finally, just thank you very much for inviting me, Johannes. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great to be with you. Thank you for your questions, really thought-provoking questions. And I do hope I'll have a visit to the Faroe Islands.
Perfect, Stefan. Shall we give a wave to our listeners? Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.